3. Gateway to the East. Little as the public beyond the cordons knew of what lurked beneath the clouds and rain which blotted out the sun in their intractable march outward from their core in the eastern mountains, everyone knew the governments of the North American continent were rolling out every possible contingency in a desperate attempt to contain it. Militaries had been hurriedly called home from bases and training excursions abroad, and rushed to defensive positions meant to halt the progress of the things within the storm. Police had been bolstered with deputized civilians familiar with the use of firearms, and retired personnel had been lured back into militias and citizen watch patrols with the promise of exorbitant pay. Though those yet to see the underbelly of the storm didn't fully grasp why, the whole of the New World was on a war footing, and this made the frightened people who cowered in the path of the clouds all the more nervous. Word from the southern border said Mexico had encamped along the Rio Grande and was shooting any who attempted to swim the gap. Coyote's smuggling tunnels had been sniffed out using leads which had long gone ignored, and for the first time in many years, the frontier between the two countries was a tightly controlled bulwark against which desperate souls, mostly Central American migrants seeking refuge in the countries from which they'd originally hailed, crashed, only to be turned back towards the clouds creeping southward over desert horizons. The thunder-haunted waters of the Great Lakes were being patrolled by Canadian vessels which sank American boats attempting to flee over the water rather than face the storm. Rangers and army personnel were scrambling to patrol the mighty, rugged boundary between the two countries, and had been forced to resort to deadly deterrents to make up for their lack in manpower. Tales about families fleeing the shattered cities of lower New England towards the relative safety of the farther north commonly ended with gunfights against Canadian personnel, who'd been ordered to stop the influx of outsiders at all costs. Whether these stories were true or false was debatable. Travel through the storm was all but unheard of, and the chaos outside it prevented reliable lines of contact between one region and another from lasting for long. After a century spent under the blanket of technological progress and interconnection, the vast distances and open spaces of North America's landmass were being reinstated by grim necessity. St. Louis was as alien to Juarez or Ontario now as it would have been a century prior, and with satellite and cellular services shaky at best, the surety of the telegraph seemed stable by comparison. What everyone knew in their bones was that something was happening beyond the wall of the storm, something which consumed the people within. It was common knowledge that those scant few who did slip out beyond the clouds into the wider world were often changed, not quite right. While the brutality of these mobilizations might have been exaggerated, the scale of them had not. The banks of the Mississippi were crawling with patrols and emplacements, and any with ears and eyes had witnessed the procession of armored vehicles and roaring aircraft across the river, from whence they never returned. Thus, all those without the money, resources, capacity, or courage to flee felt like rabbits in a tightening snare. In the face of that formidable firewall of organized defense, Luther's escape into the safe zone across the river had seemed miraculous to him at the time. Only by good fortune and the luck of arriving on a sparsely peopled and densely overgrown section of the riverbank had he escaped notice. Even then, had he lingered long, Luther knew he might have been spotted by drone or boat patrols sweeping the length of the river. Escape had been an imperative for so long, he'd hardly thought about the dangers involved until he'd finished the journey. Now, as their aging SUV bumped over tarnished and time-ravaged pavement on the northern outskirts of town and wove through half-abandoned neighborhoods near the water, he realized the insanity of the agreement he'd made. He hardly knew Aram anymore, and divorced from the powerful chains wrought by his brother's piercing eyes and iron will, he was already second-guessing himself. Eyes boring into the back of his sibling's head where it rested in the passenger's seat, Luther was really seeing shootouts and murders and rapes and lootings he'd passed on the edges of the great storm front on his way here, remembering every horror the chaos and stress and influence of the storm had brought about in vivid detail. Even if he set aside the unknown of the storm, the known was more than deadly enough. Despite the fact night hadn't truly fallen beyond the wall of slate and darkness which choked the sky overhead, it was black as night beneath the storm now. Trees whipped with sudden wind and thunder shook the ground with its roar. Old homes which might well house cowering families were lashed by the whip of wailing water, and already several trees had fallen on streets, roofs, and power lines. This was only the beginning, the comparative calm before the cataclysm which was to come. That calm was made all the more menacing by the fact that none who huddled in its grasp knew what was out there, past all that bluster and shadow. They knew only that it brought death, and they understood it with the keen surety of wild beasts in the path of a hurricane. Did these men who'd lived their years on the fringe know how bad it was? Did they know how bad it would get? How did they expect to survive a trip over some 400 miles of blood-soaked ground beneath the inexplicable rain? Most salient of all, why had he trusted Aram and his acolytes knew what they were doing? These thoughts crescendoed with the sliding halt Sias, their driver, brought to the vehicle on a gravel ramp through a dense woodline along the banks of the Mississippi. The stout man hadn't spoken at all since they'd piled into the car, and it was he that jumped first from the driver's seat after killing the engine. Soraya and Morgan, who'd sat to either side of Luther in the middle row, dragged their kits from the back seats and slid unceremoniously into the darkening rain outside, for all the world like a group of practiced soldiers going through the motions of a deployment. In a bustle, these three men went about unloading the trunk and wrapping their belongings in tarps against the storm by the harsh light of the car's pale headlights. Luther's eyes bounced to and fro, tracing what motion he could, desperate for an excuse or distraction that might act as an escape route for him. It was only after about half a minute Luther realized Aram had not left the SUV, and that his stern face was staring back at him over the shoulder of his seat up front. "This is your last chance to leave," Aram said. "I know you must be considering it. But again, I must warn you that you won't survive long on your own. You can't outrun the storm now. It's already here. The soldiers in the river won't hold back the things it brings with it for long. We stand a better chance of slipping by unnoticed behind the enemy's lines." "How can you really know that?" Luther's question seemed to amuse Aram. His brother popped open the door and slid out into a day so darkened by cloud cover it seemed dusk had fallen. Sias tossed him the keys, and Aram dragged the revolver he'd taken from Luther from a pocket before leaning into the vehicle to hold them out as offerings. "I don't have time to explain, save to say that we know," Aram said. "If that isn't enough, then take these, and good luck. Useful as it might be to have an outsider with us, you're free to go as you please. We are crossing the river now, whether you're with us or not." Luther did take them, but when Aram and the others slid into a small, aging boat crammed taut with their gear which had been hidden amongst the brush to the side of the road, Luther was with them. For all his doubt, his own uncertainty made him balk in the face of Aram's confidence. They took to the water, the sputtering little motor of the boat struggling to give them progress as the rain and thunder grew heavier overhead. Sandwiched between Sias and Soraya on the craft's middle bench like a prisoner under escort, all Luther could do as Morgan fussed over the motor and Aram called orders from the front was squint his eyes against the stinging moisture and focus in on the inky dark amongst the trees along the far shore. As his vision became less and less useful, Luther fell back upon his ears. Over the engine's whine and the thunder's roll, there was little to hear at first. But then, between spasms of chatter amongst Aram's companions, Luther heard the low thrum of helicopters overhead. Occasionally they were soaring east into the depths of the storm. Others went swiftly west, away from the great unknown. Luther could see no lights in these roiling clouds, and upward glances into the driving downpour did little but blind him. It was in those moments spent wondering at the onyx hue of the unnaturally dark afternoon sky that he realized the rain had a viscous quality to it, a sort of oily blackness, which stained the collar of his already battered shirt where it poked out from beneath his jacket. There was a scent, too, something chemical, almost rusty, as of metal gone to seed. He had just enough time to wonder whether the storm's maddening effects were down to some form of poison when a flash out before them on the shoreline caught his attention, and their boat swung downriver to close in on the position. The light blinked out from that damnable murk in the scrub 3 more times, ensuring Aram's craft was still on course as they navigated by little more than the light of the sinking sun's ambient light far off west, in the distant shred of wholesome sky the clouds had not yet conquered. A figure gradually slid into view as the tottering old boat drew in close, and before long the figure was knee-deep in the shallows, helping Aram to beach the craft and haul gear ashore. The others piled out, all heedless of getting their boots wet after the soak of the ride over, and Luther followed, still feeling as if pulled by an invisible leash. Aram and the man who'd signaled for them shared a scant few words before leading their charges up the hill through the scrub, following a well-worn path Luther imagined must have been cut for just such a blind passage. As he stumbled, the others marched with practiced ease, feeling their way where Luther had to guess. Even the seemingly frail Morgan, less steady than the others, moved with surety, and Luther had to strain to keep pace in the deepening shadow. They had drilled for this, surely. There seemed no other way. When at last they came out from the trees onto an open and partially flooded road, they grouped around Aram in the dark like troops awaiting orders. Luther strained to get a look at the 6th man in the dark, squinting against the rain, but it was no use. He was but a silhouette to him, even now. "Luther and Sariah," Aram began in tones swollen to match the roar of the storm. "This is Brother Traven. He is to be trusted. He has been preparing the way for us east of the river these past few weeks. We follow him. Traven knows the location of the Federals and the enemy." The silhouette, Traven, half bowed in the dark, but held his tongue as Aram pressed on, leaning in towards Luther to make certain every syllable rang true. "The others know the plan, but, Luther, you do not. We must be fast, but we must also be careful. Traven has hidden another vehicle for us ahead, but we go on foot the first 20 miles. We stand in the crossroads between 2 armies, and neither will hesitate to kill us if they see us. We can't afford to be seen or heard until after we've passed by the main host of the enemy. That means no lights at all. No noises beyond what's necessary. No falling behind. Understood?" Luther nodded in the dark before realizing the gesture was probably lost on the others, then managed an unsteady yes. Aram proffered a vague shape Luther realized was a sturdy flashlight, which he took up in shaking hands. "Keep that off. Keep your gun in your pocket unless I say otherwise. Move with the dark and beneath the noise. Do not be noticed." With that, Aram slapped Traven on the shoulder, spurring him into motion. Without another word, Traven stepped out of the circle and wove off southward down the roadside. The others fell into step behind him, with Luther bringing up the rear. They moved in a line, hugging the trees along the road and often wading through ankle-deep runoff water, always conscious to keep their silhouettes masked by the trees. Still darkness reigned, and there had been no lights or commotion save that of unseen aircraft since they'd left the swollen waters of the Mississippi. But Aram's group clearly felt watched, and the feeling rubbed off upon Luther as they marched on. Soon they left the riverside road and wound into the tangle of intermingled old buildings and suburbs that dotted the Illinois side of the border. It was then coming into the presence of so many apartment buildings and dead streetlights that Luther realized the power must be out. Though the lightning was so sparse as to be almost non-existent, the storm must have been wreaking more havoc than he realized. Like walking a midnight forest, the yards and fence lines of the town through which they crept were mere silhouettes through the sheeting rain, and what few glimpses of motion they caught cutting through alleys and crossing vacant lots always seemed to be buckling trees or billowing trash under the assault of the wind. More than a few times, one member or another of the line would stumble over curbs or fallen tree limbs in the blackness, but not once did they disobey the order to turn on no lights. There was a chill in the air which had nothing to do with the wind and the rain which lashed them. Through the premature night beneath the storm, the distant crack of gunfire could be heard now and then, and through all their stumbling, the thrumming of helicopter blades and roaring jet engines ebbed and flowed through the murk. Every one of the men was armed now that Luther had been handed back his gun, and yet they felt naked and helpless to a man, with none needing to hear the complaints of another to know they were vulnerable as rabbits in a wood of wolves. It was these military noises Luther most feared. After all, he'd seen firsthand that the rumors about executions and shoot-on-sight orders weren't just rumors during his flight from Chicago. The powers that be truly were mortified about some pathogen or disorder that affected those beneath the oily rain of that endless storm, and they meant to keep them contained. Given this fear, the path forged by Traven at the front confused Luther. As they went, the group hugged low retaining walls and hopped fences, steered through parking lots and shimmied down tight alleys between outbuildings in industrial parks. They never sought the total cover of the little stands of trees and patches of woodland which dotted the region, nor did they hug creek beds or the dense grass of occasional fields along overgrown roadsides. This seemed impractically risky to Luther, for it was, to his mind, far more preferable to twist an ankle on an unseen tree root in the dark than to be shot dead by military men who ruled the shadow with night vision and precision scopes. Several times the popping chorus of gunfire or the explosive impact of heavy ordnance found them nearby. Other traces of the ongoing fighting were distant, half-glimpsed muzzle flashes through tree lines, or the lights of searching soldiers in battered buildings. Once, Traven waved the others to a clumsy halt at the mouth of an alley, and they watched as the blinding lights of several armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles roared past down an adjacent road. Roof-mounted guns were firing at things in the shifting skies Luther couldn't see, but as he stared up after tracer rounds which flared red in the searing dark, he caught glimpses of shapes in the swirling cloud cover, vague forms which dove and grasped and slithered, like serpents borne aloft on the wind. It was then, insane as it made him feel, that Luther began to take seriously the notion that they might well be hunted by other, less natural things out here in the land beneath the storm. He'd always skirted the edge of the storm front, always been one step ahead of the unknown. Thus, he'd never had to truly entertain thoughts about what exactly was hiding behind it. Like most, he had put it down to a pathogen or a lawless uprising on the few occasions he'd been tempted to think on the matter at all. Even some Hollywood-grade zombie epidemic was more comprehensible than whatever this was. As they drew deeper and deeper into the thick of the chaos which unfolded around them, Luther and the others had to regularly stop to wipe grime from their eyes and pull hoods close around their faces as shields from the disgusting downpour. The oily black droplets which fell from the sky were more viscous than ever now, and made streets slick and stone treacherous with slippery residue. Everything gleamed wet in the blackness whenever gunfire or strangled lightning lit the ground, and it became more and more difficult to determine direction amidst the confusion. Traven spent almost as much time deliberating and listening to half-heard noises through the gloom as he did leading, and yet all understood his caution was necessary, and moved only when he told them to do so. As the second hour came to a close, they found themselves in the thick of a relatively classy suburb, walking streets which looked almost paradoxically calm amidst the thunder and struggle which had erupted elsewhere. Somehow this made Luther's heart race all the faster, for the thick rain was the only source of sound, and every noise they made scuffling past fence gates or squeezing through hedgerows grated on his ears. The others felt it too, and they all scanned the blacked-out windows of stately homes as if expecting to be ambushed, united in wordless paranoia. Eventually, this silence began to weigh on them, for Aram grasped Traven by the shoulder and dragged them off their course. "Something is here," Aram hissed through the tumult, just loud enough for Luther to catch the words. "Something dangerous. We need to hole up somewhere." As if in sync with his warning, there was a distant, subtle crashing in the woods which ringed this half of the suburb. It was a small thing, nothing more than a startled group of deer might make bustling through bush and branch, but somehow, beneath all that deathly quiet, doom seemed to lurk behind those sounds. Aram took the lead then, careening away from the fence they'd been hugging and toward the large house whose backyard they'd been creeping through. The building boasted a big wooden deck along the rear of the home, overlooking the woods, and it was for this Aram moved. He ducked under the support beams, crouching behind stored landscaping supplies and old tools tucked up against the struts, and his followers did their best to mimic him. They took up positions close to the ground, letting the deepest shadows of the low space beneath the deck do the work for them. Aram looked around once more, seeming to check the others were well hidden. Then, breath held against searching ears they all imagined must be seeking them out, they waited. Sprawled flat in the mud and muck, Luther could see little. As ever, only the ambient glow of the dead sky behind the clouds gave them light by which to see. The tracer rounds and muffled explosions of combat were heard, but not seen, and suddenly their absence was more cause for fear than their presence had been. In the heat of the obscured firefights through which they'd crept, Luther had jumped at each crack and bang. Now he yearned for them, and his spirit sank a little deeper with each minute that passed without them. Though he gripped the little revolver hard, it did nothing to shore up his courage. If the shrieking missiles of mighty empires didn't faze whatever was out there, he thought it unlikely a .22 would fare much better. The others bristled in the dark, making Luther flinch before doing the same. Shotgun and rifle barrels, tucked under arms or slung over shoulders until now, slid forth to point down the yard towards the fence line and the tangled woods beyond. Aram, a feeble shadow puppet in all that grim obscurity, held up a deterring hand like an officer urging restraint. Luther had just enough time to recall that old line about not firing until you'd seen the whites of the enemy's eyes, before something threw itself over the fence and splashed down in the grimy grass of the open yard. It was a shifting shape in ink against the midnight of the grass. Its features were blurred by the dark and the rain, but even through the tenebrous interference of the storm, all could see it was tall, some 6 feet taller than the 6-foot fence over which it leapt. Jagged, asymmetrical horns or antlers swept side to side as it snorted and sniffed the wet air, its great lungs rasping and rumbling with every breath. Towering upon 2 lean, stilt-like legs, it leaned back with bony arms outstretched, swaying and wavering like a drunk catching his balance. There came a low, threatening groan, almost pained, the braying growl of a starving beast on the hunt. Another shape scaled the fence, then another. Soon a pack of the things cavorted and jostled along the edge of the yard, shoving each other as often as they scoured the air. Some were broad and hefty, and some were lean and spindly as the first. Some towered and some capered low to the ground in the shadows, chittering like rabid animals. Some boasted bent legs like the hooved limbs of equines or ungulates, and others stomped on leathery pads like those of elephants. Their eyes glittered in the dark here and there, catching the gleam of distant flashes through the artificial night, and it was only after nearly a minute of suffering, shaking hands and straining eyes that Luther realized some of the things had more than one pair of them. There was no telling exactly how long the pack lingered there. Perhaps 5 minutes, by Luther's reckoning, but he'd be the first to admit his own panicked tension probably made the wait seem longer than it was. Their lingering was only broken after a particularly vicious grapple between two of the things, when one of the smaller of their number skittered away in fear up the yard, dangerously close to the shadows beneath the deck. It kept its back to the hidden group of travelers, with its many eyes always locked upon its packmates, ever wary of more treachery. The hunched little creature was a head shorter than a man, and hobbled on its hands like a spindly ape. When it finally stopped fleeing, it stood still only a moment before scenting the air once more, keen now, as it tasted a smell it might well have missed down by the fence line. Barely visible in the dark, the guns around Luther bristled again, ready to react. At that moment, when all seemed still against the onslaught of the rain, a shriek ripped through the clamor of the storm from elsewhere in the neighborhood. The heads of the gathered things from the woods snapped to attention in unison, and the first who'd come over the fence, their leader perhaps, bounded off with great loping strides towards the source of the sound. The others went with it, scurrying to keep up as it leapt fences and scaled slick walls at speed, moving through backyards further down the road. The little one brought up the rear, not bothering to throw a glance back toward the prey it might well have smelled, whatever mind it possessed entrapped by the promise of a new hunt. Aram made a break for the fence the second the pack was out of sight. Luther and the others scaled the thing, some struggling more than others on the slickened wood, and then bounded down into the woods. Branches grazed and tripped them in the dark, and several of them caught nasty gashes along their faces and hands, crashing through scrub in the blackness. They came upon a swollen creek streaked with the grime of the unnatural rain, and forded it in a tightly packed mob, never once daring to speak amongst themselves. They dodged fallen tree limbs, swept downstream in the flood, navigating mostly by sensation and sound, and held their guns high, scanning the gloom as if their eyes might adjust and make them feel safer in the impenetrable blackness of the wood. Only when they'd slipped and slid up the opposite bank out of the waist-deep stream did they stop to speak, and even then it was only for a moment. "I'd guess we're past the government men," Aram panted. "It'll all be the Dreamers' soldiers now. We'll trace the creek east a little. I think there's a spot where we can bank out of the woods into another neighborhood. We won't want to stay in the trees for long." As if to accentuate his point, a bellowing bray reverberated through the thin strip of forest lining the creek from afar, spurring them into motion again. The noise had likely come up from far downstream, but that did nothing to quell the terror in it. The cry was something like the angry bleating of a charging ram or bull, but wavered, as if whatever made it were struggling to control its vocal cords. Luther's mind, scattered and jarred as it was by all that had happened, was overcome by the image of the towering hunter from the fence line lurching through the trees, gnarled hands sweeping low in search of prey hiding in the undergrowth. Every snapped twig and disturbed puddle made him jump, and he could tell he was not the sole member of the group who felt hunted beneath the boughs. Only when they finally veered off the banks of the creek and pushed out into the open backyard of another house did he feel somewhat safe again. Traven was back in the lead now, seeming to recognize the area. They fell into line and moved fast, rounding the house and coming to the street, where they all kept low and hugged a row of trees which lined the sidewalk. The rain was so heavy now they might not have needed such precautions, for visibility was so poor each member of the group would be hard-pressed to see the man in front of him. They hugged discernible landmarks in the haze and pushed on, soaked to the bone and desperate for an escape which was still miles away over deadly ground, Sound still welled up to haunt them as they moved, for screams and roars and less describable noises found their ears often, muffled as they were by the storm. Glass shattered, metal roofing was torn, and heavy strides thrummed upon the wet earth. The street beside which they walked, which was now an ankle-deep stream of oily water, was splashed across by a running form in the murk as they passed. So thick was the mist and the rain that Luther saw nothing of the runner. He merely heard their clumsy sprint through the muck, and counted his blessings as whatever it was moved past without incident down the roadway. Though he could not be certain of anything any more, he had the distinct feeling that clattering creature had been running on far too many legs. Traven soon steered them off the road and across an empty field, and amidst the tall grass their eyes became all but useless. Every tiny animal skittering through the growth made Luther jump, and he kept himself as close to the others as was possible. Soraya, just in front of him in the line, seemed tall enough that he might be able to see over the grass, and yet, with the storm as fierce as it was, Luther wondered whether that would help at all. Getting lost in the tangle would be disastrous, and as the man at the back of the line, Luther had no one bringing up the rear behind him to set him on the right path. Fortunately for him, just as panic began to set in, they spilled from the field onto the tattered asphalt of a parking lot, falling into pursuit as Traven and Aram waved them into a run. They sprinted across the open expanse of the lot, weaving past a couple dumpsters and a few dozen cars which loomed up out of the haze to startle them. They came up against a large brick building and hugged the wall along the side of the lot. As they progressed around the structure, they came upon an aged old playground, and Luther realized the place was a school. The place yawned dark and empty, its broad glass front seeming to open up like a mouth to taunt them as they slipped past beneath the onslaught of the rain. They had slid by in single file at a jogging pace when Luther, winded and lagging behind, caught a glimmer of motion amongst the shadows behind that grimy glass. He stopped in his tracks then, stunned, heedless of the others sloshing away across the drowned lot. Luther couldn't look away. It was the first thing he'd truly seen out here beneath the storm. Everything else had been little more than ghostly sounds caught through the intervening dark, or dancing silhouettes in the glistening damp of the rain. Though it stood in shadow, this was not a silhouette, and the sight of it seemed to grip Luther tight and demand he pause a moment to try and rationalize what he was seeing. It was pressed against the plate glass of the school's lobby, overlooking the concrete stairs to the lot. The thing was huge. Its shivering bulk covered fully half the entryway to the building, and had he not been so taken by the awful form of the thing, Luther might have had cause to wonder how it had even crammed itself indoors. It was a mass of filthy fur and quaking legs, a mammalian centipede without the benefit of a solid torso or thorax to keep it steady. The body contracted and writhed like a serpent, thumping against the windows, and the many-hooved, asymmetrical legs tapped and skittered along the slick tile floor in a desperate attempt to keep pace. Open sores bled black blood which stained the glass and matted the thing's tattered fur. Heads, mostly the deformed skulls of goats or elk or deer, but occasionally the sagging faces of human beings, lolled lifeless from the flanks of the bloated body on tapering necks. Every once in a while, a few of these heads would jolt up as if startled, and even through the glass, he could hear the muffled keening of many distorted voices competing against the rumbling thunder. A particularly loud thump sounded as a fold of the thing's writhing body slammed up against a pane of the sturdy glass, and it buckled and cracked beneath the blow. Through the perforated window, shrieking yowls like the manic vocalizations of foxes rang out across the silent lot. The bleating of deer and the whining of bull elk were a part of the chorus. Luther strained, lost in his attempt to recognize what he'd been staring at, as he picked up hints of warbled speech in the mix. Hints he could not help but compare to agonized human voices. A big hand clasped hard around his arm, making him jump. Luther turned to see Soraya standing over him, eyes on the school's face as he caught sight of what the others had either missed or ignored. He'd been missed, perhaps. Soraya had doubled back to see where he'd gone. Soraya wasn't paralyzed by the thing, though. He tugged, and Luther had no strength but to stumble along after him as he ran off in pursuit of the rest of the line through the mists. Another crackling break in the glass sounded behind them, and any icy uncertainty which might have remained in Luther was dispelled as panic replaced petrified awe. Close on Soraya's heels, Luther fled up a row of cars at a full sprint before almost crashing into the rest of the line as they pushed across a street, into another dense patch of woods. Much as the crashing of glass and the swelling of the chorus of pained bleats and screeches far off behind them weighed upon Luther, he needn't have worried. The strip of woods through which they ran lasted only a few minutes. Before long they had spilled out onto an overgrown gravel path, along which was parked an aged red van. Traven dragged open the driver's side door, and before long, the whole group had tossed in their belongings and piled inside. Aram sat up front beside Traven, while the others crammed into the back rows. Luther, sitting in the middle amidst mounds of packed supplies and equipment, felt almost weightless as the van shuddered into motion and rolled forth down the road through the deepening dark, elated by their escape, but simultaneously aware that they were driving deeper into the storm. Night was likely falling beyond the muffling mask of the storm clouds overhead, and the accompanying drop in the already poor visibility made the glare of headlights painful to look on as they tore off the gravel road and sped eastward down a wooded lane. "What about the Dreamer's spawn? Won't we be seen?" It was Soraya, leaning forward over Luther's seat to better be heard by Aram up front. His eyes were wide, and his big hand gripped tight to the edge of Luther's seat. Cool and collected as the others were, Luther couldn't help but notice Soraya didn't share their calm. "We will be, whether we drive or not," Aram said. "Moving on foot was a precaution against soldiers. Around monsters it's far better to be fast than to be hidden. We were fortunate to escape the hunters today, and it was only by blind luck we lived long enough to flee. Even unseen you can be heard. Even unheard you can be tasted on the wind. It doesn't do to rely on stealth in a world which isn't your own anymore." That seemed to quell Soraya, and he sank back into the shadows at the rear of the van with Sias and Morgan. The sage Morgan muttered something to Soraya, something Luther couldn't hear. Words of assurance or comfort, perhaps. Then silence fell, and the hum of the engine and the rumbling of the road were all that remained to comfort him. Luther stared out the window at the half-formed columns of trees rolling past, considered questions he didn't dare yet ask, and waited.